It's my privilege to introduce the person who's going to be kicking off our afternoon for us. And I just want to say, by way of very brief introduction, you cannot have this conversation in Pittsburgh about sustainability and innovation and the nexus of those in this place we call home without considering PNC, which as a corporate leader has embodied a lot of these values and has demonstrated the way in terms of the possibilities around green building and green design, and thinking in a forward way about connecting that with entrepreneurship and innovation. That started with one of my personal heroes who was in the room, Jim Rohr, who used to be the head of PNC. And you know, you always worry when there's a transition with a major corporate leader like PNC that there'll be a break in something like that. And I'm so delighted to be able to say that Pittsburgh is very lucky to have, as the new leader of PNC, our next speaker, Bill Demchak. Bill is the chairman, president, and CEO of PNC. He has been willing to dive in on community issues. Dave Roger led a group of us to go and talk with Bill about the importance of getting downtown right, one of the case studies that we'll be looking at tomorrow. And we really thought this is going to be, you know, he's a busy guy, he's got a lot of things to focus all around the globe. This is going to be a tough sell. He said, I got it, let's do it. And the first conversation we had about it demonstrated that same, let's get it done, let's get to results, let's be thoughtful about the values that guide us. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our guest, Bill Demchak, Chairman, President, and CEO of PNC. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Grant. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to Mayor Peduto and Andre and everybody at the Heinz Endowments for inviting me to speak to you today. So what are we here for? And why is a banker standing in front of you talking about urban sustainability? I guarantee you everybody in the room knows more about urban sustainability than I'm ever going to know. And by the way, haven't we already figured this out? Right? I just read an article that said that Pittsburgh is the best downtown in America by Livability magazine. Right? We have the most affordable housing in the country. We have our population in downtown Pittsburgh has grown fourfold in the last 10 years. There's 4,500 people living downtown, just a dramatic change. You think about the cultural attractions we have in town, the sports teams, the new restaurants, the hotels. You know, downtown Pittsburgh is alive. Haven't we figured this out? Let's think about that. Let's step back a little bit and think through it. And let me start with a simple thought. I'm actually not from Pittsburgh. I moved here when I was 12 or 13 years old, and we moved here, family moved here from Chicago. I wasn't terribly happy about that. I like Chicago, but Dad got new work in Pittsburgh, so we get in the car and we go to Pittsburgh. And I'll never forget, by the way, the drive, you know, it's a 500-mile drive on the turnpike, and I remember in the back of the Ford LTD wagon, where when you're kids, you sit backwards in the back row with no seat belts and the windows down, and you're sucking fumes the whole way, which, by the way, makes the drive, at least back then, through Gary, Indiana, really interesting. And you get to Pittsburgh, and you see kind of the smoky skyline and the steel mills. I remember through high school, the smell of the meatpacking plants on the north side. It still sticks with me. I remember going off to college, and the steel industry was kind of in a spiral. By the time I got out of college, I think we closed the last mill in town. Unemployment in Pittsburgh was pushing 19–20% at the time. And I did what a lot of people my generation did then. We left. I left. I went to grad school. I went to New York. I worked in finance. Had a great time in New York, a great career. I met my wife there, started a family. And around about, early 2000s, we kind of decided, you know what, we don't really want to raise our kids in New York City. And some of that had to do with 9/11. That was fresh in our minds, and it's scary. But a lot of it had to do with the thought of a 90-minute commute each way every day for the rest of my life. I wouldn't get to see my kids grow up. I couldn't see them play baseball after school. I wouldn't get home for dinner. I wanted a life. So long story short, 2002, an opportunity came with PNC, and we jumped on it. and we were looking forward to a change, and boy, did we get a change. And some of you have probably heard me tell this story, but I will never forget the first day I left work in PNC headquarters. My family was still back in New York. It was 7:30 or 8 at night, and I walked down onto the street, and I thought, I got to go get a burger and a beer and watch a baseball game somewhere. And I walked down onto 5th and Wood, and I literally turned all 4 directions, and there's not a person to be seen. Nothing is open. It's dark. It's dreary. It was scary. It was empty. And, the truth is, during the 15-year period prior, we'd lost a lot of companies in downtown Pittsburgh, right? There weren't many restaurants. Retail had largely failed because we didn't have a resident population to use it, and the place was not terribly inviting. And I didn't know it then, but in 2002, Pittsburgh was right on the cusp of what we're now calling our third renaissance. And I didn't know it then, but PNC was already playing an important part in this urban renewal. In fact, we had already built our first green building by the time I arrived, First Sign Center over on the Mon, which at the time was the largest LEED 2.0 certified building in the world. And I think we were the first financial services firm to have a LEED certified building. By the way, we were knocked off the list as the largest building that same year by the Pittsburgh Convention Center. And by the way, the LEED design for the Pittsburgh Convention Center was funded by the Heinz Endowments. Thank you. But we kept at it. In 2004, we bought the Pittsburgh Public Safety Building, and we knocked that down, and we recycled 98% of the deconstructed materials, and we built First Side Park. And then we built Triangle Park on the corner of 5th and Liberty, and we liked that so much we built 3 PNC Plaza right next to it, which today is the home of the Fairmont Hotel and the headquarters of Reed Smith, and obviously offices for PNC. And 3 PNC Plaza is still one of the largest LEED buildings in the country. And we kept going. All the branches we renovated in town, or built in town. We bought the old Mellon Bank headquarters, renovated that to LEED design, and it's now a customer care center for us on 5th and Smithfield. To the Lantern Building, which we rebuilt and just recently gave to the Cultural Trust. And then finally, this fall, we're going to open the tower at PNC Plaza, and when it opens, I am told that it will be the greenest office building in the world. Now, I will admit up front that I have no idea who actually keeps score on that, but I am guaranteed that somewhere on that list we'll be very high, if not at the top. And it's actually fascinating. I've learned a lot about this recently, is exactly what we're doing in this building. But we have for example, a dual skin vented window technology where the outer layer effectively opens and will help with heating and cooling the building for 6 or 7 months out of the year. We have geothermal wells that help heat the building, massively drop our carbon footprint. We have solar chimneys that effectively will help cool the building in the summer by drawing the warm air out of the building. We collect rainwater, reuse water, dramatically drop the water usage that comes out of the building. And we look back and we've come a long way in green building. Jim Rohr, who is hiding back there, and as Grant said, my predecessor, tells a story that when he was first approached about building First Side by Gary Selson, our facilities manager, who has frankly pushed this green initiative with us. But Jim was first approached, and Gary said, "Jim, I want our new operations and tech center to be a green building." And Jim said, "We're not going to build a green building. Those are Mellon Bank's colors." And I think it's a true story because he tells it, and he wouldn't tell if it wasn't true. And we've gone from there to a place where green is now part of our culture. It's something that our employees are incredibly proud of. Every branch we build around the country is built to Green Building Council standards. We have a net zero energy branch outside of Miami that basically has zero carbon footprint. And I'm told that we have more green buildings now than any company in the whole world, which we're quite proud of. You know, you go back to the start, and I'd like to tell you that the reason we do this is because it's good for the environment. And that's an added bonus, but it wasn't the primary driver as to why we go green. We go green because it's good for our employees, it's good for our customers, and it's good for our communities. We thrive as an institution when the communities where we live and work thrive. Symbiotic relationship. And our employees are much more productive inside of a lightened area and open space. They love it, they're proud of it. We save money through time on energy, but it's about the employees, it's about the communities. And by the way, during this period of time when PNC was building all this stuff, I think Mary, you said there's $6 billion of capital expenditure inside of Pittsburgh over the last 10 years. And you see it in the skyline. Think about all the new housing that's downtown, the new hotels, the office buildings, money spent on infrastructure, a tremendous amount of progress. Pittsburgh, you think about it, it's alive at night now. Go back to when I walked out of the office building when I first came here and it was dead. I walk out now and there's kids out jogging, there's stuff going on all over the place. It's terrific. But the truth is we can do more, and we need to do more. We have issues. You know, for example, workforce development, something I'm engaged in. Today, both because of the age demographic drain we had when people like me left 20 years ago, but also because we're not training people today with the skill sets we need for the jobs of tomorrow. We need to do better at that. We have infrastructure challenges, both in funding and build. We have transportation challenges. We have connectivity issues with our airport to other regional hubs and international. And we have safety and congestion issues right inside the city today, things we can get after. And I'm actually really excited to be involved in a new project that you heard the mayor and the Pittsburgh Downtown Partnership announce a couple of weeks ago, called Envision Downtown, which in its most simple form is about making Pittsburgh a safer, easier place to get around. Whether you're on a bus, you're in a car, you're out for a jog, you're riding a bike, you're walking, make Pittsburgh safer, easier, friendlier. You know, you may not know it, but actually 54%, I just learned this, 54% of the people who work downtown take mass transit in every day. It's an incredible percentage, right? We should be proud of that. I mean, I'm told it dwarfs every other major city in the country. But we don't make it easy for people who do that. Right? Think what you see when you walk the streets. You see individuals are standing in the rain, they're standing in snow, there's no shelters over them, they're crowding the whole sidewalk so that if pedestrians who's trying to get to work or to lunch wants to get wherever they're going, they're walking into a crowd of people who are waiting to get on their bus, so they can't get through there. So what do? They walk out onto the street, and then they block the bus, which causes traffic, causes accidents, and is dangerous. Really simple things we can do to make stuff better in downtown Pittsburgh. We don't make it easy for disabled people. Right? I talked about the challenge we have in working demographics and needing to get qualified people to jobs. We don't make it easy for disabled people to be productive workers in our community, and we can do that. Simple things. Shave the curb so a wheelchair can go up the curb. Right? Real easy fixes. We don't have to boil the ocean. Envision Downtown is about making Pittsburgh a friendlier, easier, nicer place, whether you're a resident, you're a commuter, or you're a visitor. And we're going to start with studying. You always start with data. So we're starting with studying traffic patterns, accident history. I didn't realize this either, but it turns out every time you build a new building in Pittsburgh, we actually have to measure traffic around the building. So our new building, the tower at PNC Plaza, has lots and lots of data of how traffic moves downtown. We're going to use that data. We're going to deploy technologies that will reduce congestion, make things safer, potentially reroute traffic and streets. We're working with CMU and the University of Pittsburgh to make downtown Pittsburgh kind of a learning lab for smart city technology. One of the things that I'm really excited about that CMU's developed, I think in conjunction with the Hillman Foundation, is new traffic signal technology, right? So the old traffic lights, you know, they count down from 30 and then they turn irrespective of whether anybody's crowded at one corner or the other. The new signals learn. They measure traffic density, they adjust, and they do it in a smart network so streets work together. You reroute traffic when there's congestion. Lots of great things we can do and envision downtown to make downtown Pittsburgh a better place. You know, at the end of the day, I am a banker who doesn't know a whole lot about urban sustainability, but I'm responsible for 9,000 employees who work downtown, an increasing number of them who live downtown. PNC is a customer service organization. We survive and thrive when we field the very best, most diverse and talented and engaged team of employees that we can in front of our customers. That's how we win. And we win when our communities win, right? How can I attract and retain good people if the environment that I'm asking them to work in is not appealing to them? Envision Downtown is ambitious, but it is achievable, and we can do it. And I'm smart enough to know that success in this endeavor helps ensure PNC's success in the future, and that's why I'm committed to it. And I thank all of you for spending the time today, and I thank the Heinz Endowments for continuing to focus on making Pittsburgh an ever better place to live, work, visit, and enjoy. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing the place section of the program. My name is Ray Gastel. I'm the planning director in the city of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to do a very brief introduction to this section, but just because we've heard so much good stuff about place already in this program and the connection between all the aspirations that we have here vis-a-vis energy, community, sustainability, and place, but this group is really going to bring it home in that particular arena. And so I just need to say that this is a group which has expertise in energy, expertise in breaking the boundaries of contemporary design expectations, expertise in making a walkable city, and also an incredible expertise in the impact of technology in having a positive social impact on community and society. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Amory Lovins, a man who truly needs no introduction. And as he told me, that's the best introduction he's ever had. But I'm going to add one sentence, that he is the co-founder and chief scientist of the Rocky Mountain Institute and the author of Bold Business Solutions, or rather Reinventing Fire, Bold Business Solutions for the New Energy Era, and has been one of the people who got there first, who has been thinking about energy and society and the relationship between the two and how we make our world more sustainable before almost anyone else in this room did. And we're really fortunate to have him as part of this conference. Thank you, Amory.
Well, thank you. Good to be back in Pittsburgh and provide a little context about some of the big things happening at unexpected and accelerating speed in the national and world energy scene. Let me start with a business book we put out a few years ago. 61 of us in 6 quarters constructed a kind of grand synthesis of U.S. energy potential called Reinventing Fire. And it shows rigorously how to run a 2.6-fold bigger U.S. economy in 2050 using no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, a third less natural gas, tripled efficiency, quintupled renewables, emitting 85% or so less carbon, and costing $5 trillion less than business as usual in net present value, assuming that all hidden or external costs, including carbon emissions, are worth 0, a conservatively low estimate. We found this could be done with no new inventions and no act of Congress, because the policy changes needed could be done at a city or state level or a federal administrative level, but rather the transition could be led by business for profit. And the $5 trillion on the table is an ample inducement. The U.S. is actually on this trajectory so far, only we're a bit ahead in renewables. But for example, our use of electricity and gasoline have both been falling since 2007, and we can further accelerate those falls at historically reasonable rates by having some smart policies in mindful markets, but most of all through 4 kinds of innovation, not just the usual 2, technology and public policy, but also design, the way technology is combined, and also new business models, new competitive strategies, new financing methods. There's huge innovation in all of those areas, and they give much more than the sum of the parts. So we could actually follow the reputed advice of General Eisenhower that if a problem is too big to solve, enlarge it. Don't chop it up into little bite-sized pieces, but move the boundaries out until they encompass what the solution requires: more options, more synergies, more degrees of freedom. As a small example, automakers are starting to make electric cars out of stuff like this. This is my little carbon cap. But it's just a test piece for military helmets that have been shipping for some years using a production process one of our spin-offs developed that we sold now into the supply chain. It's with a German Tier 1. Let's see. I don't know if you can hear it ring, but it rings like a bell because it's extremely stiff and strong. And now this process can make 2 by 2 meter complex carbon fiber structural parts for autos in 1 minute, just as this was made in 1 minute 8 years ago. Well, if we made all our cars that way, we'd save a lot of lives because this stuff absorbs 6 to 12 times the crash energy of steel per pound and does so more smoothly. But also, we would save oil equivalent to half an OPEC or 1.5 Saudis at a cost of $18 a barrel. That just pays for the electrification because the ultralighting turns out to be approximately free. It's paid for by much simpler manufacturing with 80% less capital and by needing 3 times fewer of the costly batteries or fuel cells. But once you have electric cars becoming affordable much sooner because you need so few batteries, BMW indeed says the carbon fiber in the i3 is paid for by needing fewer batteries, then you have a lot of distributed storage in the grid that can more gracefully integrate varying solar and wind power. So it turns out to be easier to solve the car and electricity problems together than separately. And we find those kinds of synergies throughout the energy system when we carefully integrate all 4 sectors that use energy, namely transport, buildings, industry, and electricity. And our team works in equal depth in all of those. Now, this is not just a U.S. potential. We will release in 2 months work with the China Energy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and the top energy policy and analytic shops in Beijing attached to the National Development and Reform Commission, because the paramount leaders of China have called for a revolution, not a word they use lightly, in the consumption and production of energy. They need it because they're running the world's 2nd biggest economy on basically 1920s Pittsburgh fuel and technology, except the technology is moving fast, the fuel more slowly, so you can't breathe the air. That really gets their attention. Our group, 80 of us for 2 years now, in mostly Beijing and Berkeley, has been working out the roadmap for that revolution. Our customers are the authors of the energy content of the 13th five-year plan, and they're very keen to apply what we've come up with, which is even better than for the US, namely by 2050 in China, 6-fold higher energy productivity, 11-fold higher carbon productivity, so the peak carbon occurs even earlier than promised, and several $1 trillion cheaper than business as usual. The reason China can do a bit better than we can is that they're a bit less efficient to start with, but also they're building so much infrastructure and can more easily build it right than fix it later. You've heard a lot, I expect, about the global revolution in renewable energy, and it's self-reinforcing because the cheaper it gets, the more we buy, so the cheaper it gets, so the more we buy. And it scales in a fundamentally different way than the old energy sources. If you build a cathedral-like power plant, it takes many years to design, license, and build. But meanwhile, with about the same capital, you could build a whole string of photovoltaic plants, each of which produces annually enough solar cells to produce annually as much electricity as your cathedral was going to produce once it's built. And if you put realistic numbers on that, even after the first 10 years, you got 15 times as much solar as cathedral produced electricity, and then the solar just runs away. So that's why solar is scaling faster than cell phones worldwide. Wind is also scaling very fast. Wind and solar and a few minor non-hydro renewables together, each of the past 4 years have added over 80 gigawatts. They add more than all the fossil and nuclear plants add in capacity, not counting their bigger retirements. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which tracks all these transactions, thinks that in the next 15 years, the additions of fossil and nuclear plants worldwide, again, not counting bigger retirements, will be cut by half because they can't compete anymore. They have no business case, while the additions of renewables will at least triple. And indeed, those modern renewables, each of the past 4 years, have gotten over $250 billion a year in private investment, which is a good deal more than the total market cap of the coal industry. So things are changing very fast and accelerating rapidly. For example, Tony Seba, the Stanford Innovation Lecturer, came up with a couple of lovely photos from the National Archive looking down Fifth Avenue in the Easter Parade in Manhattan. In 1900, you have to look hard to see the first car. In 1913, you have to look even harder to find the last horse, which illustrates how the pace of transformation when things get going like this is set not by incumbents but by insurgents. They are not inhibited by the incumbents' physical or psychological assets, not encumbered by their business models or cultures. They don't need all the same infrastructure. And indeed, investors flee before customers do. As soon as the capital markets sent the whiff of disruption, they don't wait for the old industries to be in the toaster or heading for the toaster or for the toast to get done. They're out of there. They invest in the new stuff. And indeed, the electricity and oil industries, as we have known them, are now being decapitalized because there are better buys. That's why Solar City pays 200 or 300 basis points less for capital than the average utility does. It's less risky. It's a yield co. And indeed, when we put out a report last year called The Economics of Grid Defection on how the ability to switch to a combination of ever cheaper photovoltaics and ever cheaper batteries was going to sweep across the country well within the lives of existing utility assets, Barclays downgraded the whole utility sector because the old business models would have no place to hide, and they're not ready for that kind of competition. So that's why we pulled together a bunch of incumbents and insurgents to figure out together in a safe place what the next electricity industry looks like, and how to create mutual value rather than just lobbing grenades in public. That's called eLab, Electricity Innovation Lab, and it's all open source at rmi.org. The numbers are really compelling. New wind and photovoltaic power in levelized cost typically beat anything on the supply side, including new gas plants, and they have a stable price, not a volatile price. Efficiency is even cheaper. And to go back to reinventing fire, the internal rates of return we found, just to illustrate, were 33% for tripling or quadrupling the efficiency of buildings, new and old, 21% for doubling the energy productivity of industry, 17% for getting U.S. mobility completely off oil. That's about $25 a barrel. So if your oil business feels pain at $90 and swoons at $50, how will it do at $25? That's what it has to compete with, and that's falling. And the IRR for all of the above plus an 80% renewable, half-distributed, highly resilient electric system is 14%. I'm not counting, of course, enormous externalities, positive and avoided negative, that would make the returns just astronomical. But I want to end with a few remarks on how quickly things are changing on the demand side, because the big game changer we found in reinventing fire is what's called integrative design. This has been cooking in our little black swan hatchery for a few decades. We've now demonstrated it in over 1,000 buildings and $40 billion worth of new and old factories and a bunch of vehicles. And what it enables you to do is design a building or factory or piece of equipment or vehicle as a whole system for multiple benefits, rather than isolated components for single benefits, and thereby get much bigger energy savings at typically lower capital cost than smaller no savings. So you get expanding returns, not diminishing returns. As a small example, I live in a fairly severe climate. It used to go to minus 47F on occasion, 7,100 feet up in the Rockies near Aspen, but I'm a passive solar banana farmer. In the middle of our house, we've just ripened 58 banana crops, and we don't do combustion. That's so 20th century. We don't have a heating system, and the capital cost of not putting in a heating system was bigger than the stuff we did pay for to get rid of it, so the construction cost went down. And this was an archetype for 30,000 odd passive buildings in Europe. Indeed, in Dutch social housing now, there is now a nice effort, which is about a year, I think, from really making this work. They've cut the cost in half in a year now, to retrofit to net zero energy standard and pay for the financing entirely out of saved energy. Or to give you another example of how fast things are moving, when I led the design for the retrofit of the Empire State Building in 2010, we thought it was pretty decent to have saved 38% of the energy with a 3-year payback using integrative design. But then 3 years later, our team did a 70% saving retrofitting a really tough half-century-old federal complex in Denver, facing the wrong way, everything wrong with it. And that made it more efficient than the most efficient new office in the United States, which in turn is only half as efficient as our own new office being built right now and requiring no heating or cooling equipment because we designed it out. Of course, that saves a lot of capital cost. So that's about an 85% reduction in energy intensity in 5 years, starting with a pretty decent design. So this is not over yet. The low-hanging fruit keeps growing back faster than we can pick it. Efficiency techniques and ways to finance and deliver them keep improving faster than we can install them, so the unbought negawatt reserve keeps getting ever bigger and cheaper. And indeed, this low-hanging fruit is mushing up around our ankles, spilling in over the tops of our waders, and you got a whole bunch of it in Pittsburgh. So lots to do on the supply side, let them all compete, but efficiency is a huge, largely untapped resource using modern technology, design, financing, marketing, delivery, and I hope you all make a lot of money at it. Thank you.
Emery, I was going to ask you one question. Just one question before you go.
Yeah.
Just one question on the integrative design question, because this is about when this gets local, scaling to the local. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about when you think about places and where, you talked about the Empire State Building and other kind of iconic structures and so forth, but when you apply this kind of global thinking and this energy efficiency that we need to use, how does that apply to places as you understand it?
Well, every place is different, and every place has different obstacles and opportunities. Of course, the whole trick is the obstacle into opportunity alchemy, as Ray Anderson said, turning stumbling blocks into stepping stones. But I think in a city of this, with buildings of this vintage, you should probably take a look at retrofitdepot.org, which has a nice toolkit if you own a real estate portfolio for figuring out how to do the right things in the right order at the right time. Why do I say at the right time? Well, consider a 1970s curtain wall office building in Chicago, not too different a climate, hot and cold, and the glazing seals are failing in 1992. This is an actual case. That happens at that age. Every 20 years you need to reskin the curtain wall. And rather than replacing with the awful glass that was there, we found if you put in even early 90s super windows, for an extra 78 cents for each square foot of glass, you could insulate 4 times, actually 8 times better. I think we didn't go quite that well. But you could also make it almost perfect in letting in light without heat. And if you combine that with deep daylighting, which you can retrofit all through the floor plate, and very efficient lights and office equipment, which you could do even better now, guess what? You need 4 times less peak cooling on a hot afternoon. Well, you have to do stuff to renovate the old mechanicals anyway because of age and CFCs, but now you can make that system not just 4 times more efficient, but also 4 times smaller, saving you $200,000 because you save more making it smaller than you pay more to make it efficient. And that's enough to pay for the extra cost of the windows, the daylighting retrofit, the lighting retrofit. Guess what? Minus 5-month payback. It's cheaper than the regular 20-year renovation you have to do anyway that saves nothing. Well, you're going to have, if you have a portfolio, it's going to take you decades to fix up the whole thing anyway, but if you synchronize that with what you're doing anyway, when you touch the building in some expensive way, maybe 5% of them a year, you can get through them all and create enormously better real estate value, human performance, community value, and we have a whole treatise on that about value beyond energy cost saving, showing gains in value and productivity and health and so on that are worth often 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more than the energy savings, which are really juicy. So right things in the right order at the right time, and you can make some really magical places. You can make buildings that create delight when entered, health, happiness, and productivity when occupied, regret when departed.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Health and happiness. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. So our second speaker is Kai-Uwe Bergman, who is with BIG, a firm that is both about architecture and also is beyond architecture in the scale and scope of what its work is, including the Big Ideas group, which it's now formed. And I can just introduce this group by the sense of scale that this group has, that they have moved from the urban acupuncture to working at a full city-wide scale, as they'll show you in New York at this time, and how they've combined the issues of environment and sort of trying to meet metrics for performance with incredible sense of the experience. And I can tell you that just through one small bit, and then we'll go right to the speaker, which is that I didn't know why all my students at Penn State a couple of years ago, everything they drew, every time we asked them to do housing, it always sort of went like this. It was always stepped and seemed to have gardens at each level. And I was like, what is this mysterious form which is now taken over? And then it became very clear that this was an amazing design that Big had brought forward, which was a new and opened up way of thinking about the possibilities of design. So, I'd like to introduce Kai-Uwe Bergman. Thank you.
Hello. I basically came from, let's see, can't go back. I came from New York, right behind me, just yesterday, to Pittsburgh. And this is maybe an image that's in your memory of this Superstorm Sandy that actually occurred. And it actually created an entirely new neighborhood. You've all heard of Soho and Tribeca. Well, I lived in Sopo, south of Power, for about 2 weeks. I worked in Sopo for 2 weeks, tried to work. It's somehow interesting that almost a calamity has to happen in our cities before we really begin to think about what are the underlying infrastructures and how do they work. Because in this instance, the city of New York realized it needed to do something about climate change. And what was interesting about the areas that flooded during Sandy, if you go back to the New York that the Pilgrims first sort of arrived and looked at, and or perhaps the Vikings before the Pilgrims, then everything that was actually granite and the island of 1650 remained dry. Everything that's been sort of man-made and infilled flooded. Canal Street was a canal. Water Street became the edge of the city again. So what happened is that the Housing and Urban Development Department with the Rockefeller Foundation held a competition that stretched over a year and a half, where they asked for designers and entire teams of engineers to think about the entire northeast corridor that was affected by Sandy and come up with solutions. This was not a competition where you were given actually a brief. They asked you to figure it out yourself. They asked you to find the site. They asked you to pose the problem, and they asked you to actually solve it. And that was a really interesting thing to be in. And what we actually took was Lower Manhattan as our site, all the areas that were flooded, and we created the Big U, literally a sort of protective berm, an infrastructure that would basically provide the kind of resiliency against climate change and sea surges that stretched from West 57th all the way to East 42nd. So literally, the area that was blacked out would in the future be able to be lit. And we see it as kind of the High Line, which is an existing infrastructure, a railroad, and then placing the urban amenity or public park on top. So ours, the Big U, became sort of the dry line, the same way of thinking of actually a protective infrastructure that then also becomes a public amenity over the entire 10 miles that it protects. That basically infrastructure can actually think about the people it will serve. It thinks about the activities that those people actually have. So that, I mean, what exactly does that mean? Well, you need to protect the city to up to 15 feet of surge in these kind of climactic events. That's sort of the 100-year storm. And instead of a wall that sort of disassociates people from their city, the idea was to actually create urban furniture, a bench. That bench could become a stage. The stage could start to sort of activate with sort of public life, a bike path, a kiosk, and that it basically becomes integrated into the city. So what you see behind me would happen about 99.9% of the time, people activated and using the infrastructure that is actually there as a piece of urban furniture. And then in those instances of storm events, it would then also protect the city. So we actually were awarded as one of 6 winners of the competition. And I'm proud to say that of the 10 miles, 2 miles has now been funded by the Housing and Urban Development Department to the tune of $335 million. So this is, again, something that a year and a half ago, Manhattan would be considered perhaps one of the laggards in terms of storm resiliency or climate change initiatives. And through Sandy, the superstorm, actually has catapulted into sort of a leading position of actually looking at how public space and how the public agencies can work together, and in this case also with the private landholders that are along the edge, and come up with solutions for the city. We call this social infrastructure, the idea that the people and the infrastructure are actually thought about simultaneously. One of our first projects, the Copenhagen Harbor Bath, is actually another demonstration of what social infrastructure is. It also means that you don't have to spend a lot of money to actually create some pretty cataclysmic change. This is Copenhagen, which is Copenhagen means the harbor to shop. So it is literally a city that is built on commerce, much like Pittsburgh. And that commerce, which always was right in the middle of the city with the canal, created a situation that all of the industry was on that canal, pumping all of its residue into the canal. It was a canal you didn't want to live close by because it smelled, because it had all of the sort of poisonous residue that factories and commerce actually produces. So people lived very far away, 5, 6 blocks away from the water. But then the people demanded change. And in the 70s and 80s, they asked these kind of cement factories and soya warehouses and different places to sort of get out. And so slowly, through grassroots efforts, the city started to demolish those plants along the main canal and started to think about it as actually a space for the people. Now it's called Copacabana. And you actually go down to the edge of the water. You can take an entire promenade and walk for 6-7 kilometers from one side of the city to the other, and you're now passing cultural amenities. Even the water quality was something that was important to the city of Copenhagen. It took them 10, 15 years, but through passive means, through algae and other instances, they actually cleaned the water. And then to celebrate that the water was clean enough to swim in, they held a tiny little competition, 300,000 euro, to build a bathing platform. And that bathing platform was our first project as architects, big. And we basically created that place that the city never had and really changed the people's perception of that part of the city. Suddenly, the real estate prices around the harbor bath rose by 50% because suddenly it was a place that was desired to actually be and to live. Another social infrastructure project that we've worked on is the Danish National Maritime Museum. It is an old, abandoned shipyard. This is Helsingør. It's about an hour north of Copenhagen. And this is what the soul, this is the commerce of that city. And it was for hundreds of years, built about on the backs of building wooden ships and then steel ships. It had 8 berths that you could actually build these ships. And when globalization happened, those industries were removed. They went to Korea, to other parts of the world, and the city lost its soul, lost its mojo. And these dry docks were wet docks because they were just filled in with water. Well, the city made and did something about it. They had a master plan that was called Kulturværftet, or Culture Harbor. They went and applied for the UNESCO World Heritage designation for the castle, Kronborg, which is the setting of Hamlet in Shakespeare's play. And these things, these first initial steps, started a chain reaction of change where the industrial buildings suddenly were reused. Similar buildings like this were made into theater or performance spaces. And we were given the task to take one of these dry docks and make it into the home of the Danish National Maritime Museum. Instead of filling the dry dock, which was actually what the competition asked us to do, we decided to dig up around the dry dock, place the museum on outside, and let the whole, or the space, actually become a part of the exhibition. So here you can see how the dry dock almost becomes like a donut of a program. And you start up at the top and you walk all the way around, and it's all on a slope, so you're always like on a ship. You're never quite straight. You're always on a slight angle, and you're learning about the very proud heritage of the Danish Maritime Museum and maritime traditions. So the museum could not stick out a single inch from the actual ground floor because of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. You couldn't impede the visual sort of connection. So the entire museum is actually 9 floors underground. And you walk across these bridges. The bridges also provide shortcuts from one gallery to another. And the space is actually left open 24/7 to the public. Anyone can come down there and activate that space. Inside the museum, this is the stair that takes you straight back to the top. And you have a cafe that's also publicly accessible. And you can see this sort of marriage between old and new, and really refreshing these buildings that have served a whole nother purpose inside. So what you need, and I think several of the speakers today have already touched on this, you need to activate the people, the citizens. And the way that we do that in our work is that we call this sort of extreme public participation. This is a project that's actually not a building. It's the space between buildings. Now, in Europe, much like in Pittsburgh, basically transportation sometimes takes over. Here it's freeways, in Europe it was railways. And these railways, they cut large swaths through the downtown areas, cutting one neighborhood from another, really allowing for one neighborhood to suddenly be kind of decentralized and as such have a disadvantage to any of the other more central neighborhoods. That was the case in this neighborhood. This was the swath of the rail. Once the cars came in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the rails were yanked out. Light rail was sort of replaced with buses and cars. And so these became leftover spaces for decades, until the city decided once again to look at these spaces and to do something about it. And here, the idea was to take 1 kilometer of this space and to start to think of it and program it. Now, this is one of the most multicultural neighborhoods in Copenhagen. And what we decided to do was to actually ask the people who live there to tell us about their objects, their favorite benches, their favorite fountains, their favorite lampposts. So we broke the 1 kilometer into the red square, the black market, and the green park. And then we listened to these different people and asked them to tell us and share with us all of these great, wonderful things. We collected 108 objects, and as architects, we became curators of space. We placed these objects into their locations. Even the landscaping, even the palm trees are from China and literally can grow in a Scandinavian climate. So you actually can see not everything made the cut. The city decided that this swing was a little bit too crazy. But the swing from Baghdad is now in Copenhagen. This is a slide from Chernobyl that we had to rebuild because this one was a little bit too much radiation. But we have the real red square sign from Moscow. We have bollards from Ghana that are now in Copenhagen. We have benches. This is also a wonderful sort of study about people. This is a bench from the Mediterranean region where 2 lovers look at each other in the eyes and tell each other how much they love each other. This is a bench from Belgium. Remember, the EU is in Brussels. Everyone looks in different directions and never talks to each other. Here we have a nice little plaything from Japan that a Japanese citizen in Copenhagen remembered as a child. And from America, the donut sign. So that's now in Copenhagen, celebrating donuts, basically, that you can't actually eat. And then if you need to go to the dentist, this is the dentist sign from Qatar. That's now in Copenhagen. So these are the people who actually asked for these things and objects to be coming to their place. So it is a park by the people, for the people. And these are all things that are actually made, in our case, possible by the sort of the support by Realdania that actually presented this morning. And as such, Realdania is actually a foundation that works very intimately with architects and designers to think about how the future of a city can be. We were given the task of actually thinking about the next 40 years of Copenhagen. Copenhagen is built like the hand that you see here. It is made up of the downtown area and then light rail that comes out. And this hand has actually functioned and worked so well over the past 40 years that you can literally see how the city looks just like that hand. And then the green parks between the fingers allow you to bring the parks all the way into the center of the city. We have created a new light rail that actually crosses the hand across the knuckles, which you see in the yellow dotted line. And in the future, we see that as actually a potential of actually really thinking about how the future development of the city could be. That the light rail and that the transportation company can actually become a development company, so that you would actually develop the stations as the highest density along that route. Even the area underneath the rail has potential of actually being developed. So you use the station to slow the train down and to speed it back up as it goes to and leaves the station. So these are things that we feel we can actually provide sort of visions and ways of actually working together. I have just one more project to show, and then I'll be out of here. But the idea here is actually that we didn't stop with just thinking about Copenhagen and trying to solve that issue. We took it all the way over to Sweden and thought about the entire region of Denmark and Sweden and how transportation could actually solve that problem. For the first time, you would have pink in a flag, with sort of Denmark and Sweden sort of coming together to actually work on something. The scale of Copenhagen, Helsingborg, and Malmö working together is the same scale as Oakland, San Jose, and San Francisco. So it's thinking about how you can actually think on a regional way of making that happen. And to finally sort of say that, or I'll close it there because you need to finish.
It's the right line. It's the right line. Hedonistic sustainability. You can't really can't do better than that. Listen, just one question.
Sure.
You have a great. You and your firm and your partners have such a great capacity to imagine experience, and that's sort of like the rock solid core of your capacity. And for people to imagine what they don't even necessarily know they want.
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering how you sort of like, you've now worked in a variety of ranges of cities and so forth. I'm not asking you to think about Pittsburgh per se, but like as you sort of imagine, how do you make that dialogue work? What is the sort of secret sauce in the conversation that you have with folks to kind of both get their ideas, but also help some new ideas come up?
I think it's one of engagement and one of communication. Mm-hmm. So you have to be open and listen, and you have to then take what has been said and actually use that as your kind of data point or your start. I think that maybe design and designers sometimes are viewed as someone who comes in with a grand scheme and kind of just puts it out there as an artist. I would say that we're more seen, or we see ourselves as facilitators in the discussion that communities and the public and the private sector, the public sector actually have. And so what we try to do in the work and in the way that we work is to listen, to analyze, to prioritize, and then to basically offer some solutions that we can then work together to find that are workable.
Great. Thanks a lot. I need to take this from you. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. So, very fortunate that we have next speaker, Jeff Speck. Jeff Speck is a person who has been a co-author of Suburban Nation, author of The Walkable City, and who is one of the sort of most clear and crisp thinkers and communicators about what it really takes to put walking first and to put that type of place first in how you do your work. I knew him first as his director of design for the National Endowment for the Arts, but he's moved on with such an amazing career, moving through this scale of taking that national perspective and that international perspective and bringing it home very locally to North America and other cities in a very place-based way. So I'd really like to introduce Jeff Speck.
Thank you, Ray. What Ray neglected to mention is that in this project team, I am the one sociopath. So I'll dispense with the pleasantries, except to say that I love coming to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is one city where every time I come here, I imagine myself living here. And that doesn't always happen, but it's the kind of city that gives you that feeling. Yes, clap, clap. But it is that kind of city, and it's just wonderful how the people who live here understand that and are working to make it so much better. So I'm here to talk about the walkable city. I give talks about why we need it, and I like to give talks about how to do it. I'm not going to give you the talk about why we need it, because you already get it here. You understand that. You've been hearing from a lot of other speakers who explain why your city needs to be so walkable. And also, it's a TED Talk. So if you want to see it, go to TED, look me up, and you can see that talk, which is not what you're getting today. What you're getting today is how to do it. And we begin with this premise, that walkable places are thriving places. We used to have to argue to convince people of this. We don't have to anymore. That premise leads to this question: if walkable places are thriving places, how do you get people to walk? Which leads to what we call our general theory of walkability. The general theory of walkability is the backbone of my book, Get a Good Look. I hope you read it, Walkable City. And this is such a short version of what I've been able to lay out at length in the book. So if you want to learn more, there it is. But the question is, if the question is how do you get people to walk in America, where driving is so easy and so cheap, and the car is there in the driveway between you and everything, then the answer is the walk has to be as good as the drive. And to accomplish that, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. And if you don't do all 4 of those things, you will not create walkers by choice. And if we don't create walkers by choice, we don't develop our city around walking, and therefore, those who don't have a choice but to walk have a city that does not serve them well. So this has to be our collective goal. So the first category, and those 4 mandates are the structure of my talk today. The first category, the reason to walk, is what we call, my mentors taught me, Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, we call the story of planning and the story of the planning profession. And what that was, of course, was that people were choking on the soot from your dark satanic mills, right? And the planners came along and said, hey, what if we move the people away from the factories and put the housing somewhere else than from the factories? And of course, when that happened, the planners were hailed as heroes because lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and essentially we've been trying to repeat that great victory ever since, with the onset of Euclidean zoning and the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use. And I was an art history major, and they say that's not so valuable, but I can say, you don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. Syrah was the pointillist, right? And the finest grain of use. And now, of course, we're not zoning by use at all anymore. We're zoning by form, by building type. But if you must zone by use, for example, to keep that liquor store away from the high school, then you just do it at the smallest possible grain, the confetti scale of zoning. And our most walkable places then have the tightest zoning of uses. And this then kicks into the new urbanism was mentioned earlier. I try to not leave a place without very quickly telling the fundamental story of new urbanism, which is to understand that there are only 2 tested ways to make community throughout history and across cultures. One is the traditional neighborhood, defined as being compact, as being walkable, as being diverse, places to live, work, shop, recreate, all close by. The other, of course, is suburban sprawl. The name tells you it's not compact. Whole square miles hold just one thing, often just one house, repeated over and over again. And then because so few of the streets actually connect anywhere, those few that do become what we call traffic sewers. They move as many vehicles as possible. They're noxious. The houses turn their backs to them. You see that? And so you have maybe a walkable cul-de-sac within a completely unwalkable system. So sprawl is fun to break down into its constituent parts: the places where you only live, the places where you only work, the places where you only shop. Our civic institutions get bigger and bigger and bigger, separated from each other then by further and further distances, and the ratio of the parking lot to the school tells you all you need to know about this typical South Florida high school, which is, no child has ever walked to it, no child will ever walk to it, and the seniors and the juniors are driving the sophomores and the freshmen with the death rates to back it up. And then even athletic facilities, so that it's great, that Weston in Florida has 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds, but, that kid needs his mom to drive him a mile to get to that facility. Of course, when we were young, there were no soccer moms, because we all had 1 or 2 facilities in close proximity. So supersizing, separating, and if you separate everything from everything else and you reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then of course your highway system, which was created for commerce and created for holiday travel, becomes a commuting way. And we invest more and more in our roadways. So I always tell people, this for many is the American dream. Not for that many anymore. It's probably about only 10% that want a house that is isolated from every other use. But if this is your dream, then this is the other half of your dream, because the 2 come together. and they're part of the same system, which is the other system. Often to absurd extremes, the investment that we make in our horizontal infrastructure, right, robbing our churches and robbing our post offices and our city halls of great architecture so that we can have a gold-plated ground plane. Because God help you in this environment, if you're stuck for 2 cycles at a signal, you want to shoot yourself, right? So it has to not allow that to happen. So the experience of being a driver can be extraordinarily frustrating. This is not Photoshop. This is a real intersection. It's no fun being a driver, and being a pedestrian can be even worse. So this is a slide that the doctors have been showing for 15 years now. You know, I got this from an epidemiologist who's one of many people who say, you know, the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their children than their parents, and that fully 1/3 of all children born after the year 2000 are expected by the CDC to become diabetic, is because we've engineered out of our lives the useful walk. And the idea that you would not consider it absurd to drive to park in the parking lot, to take the escalator to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is at the fundamental root of so many problems in our society. So these are the 2 forms of development. And now I'm ending the part of the talk where I talk about new growth. Because this has been all about, you know, how do we make new places? You either make sprawl or you make neighborhoods. It's the same stuff, but how big is it? How close together is it? And do you have a network of streets as opposed to very few streets, what's called a branching or dendritic system? And these are the 2 models. Now I'm going to talk entirely about what I spend most of my time on now, which is the improvement of existing city centers like yours. And if you're looking at a downtown or the potentially walkable area surrounding a downtown, and you want to make it, right, we're in the useful category, you want to make it as useful as possible, you ask this question: what is underrepresented? Among all these different uses, usually it's housing. In most historic downtowns, housing is not well represented. When housing comes back, everything gets firing, every cylinder gets firing, and the things that aren't as good as they could be immediately get better. What you're looking for in cities like yours is a jobs-housing balance. I believe we just guessed your downtown jobs-housing balance is about 10-to-1. And the closer you get it to 1-to-1, the more of a successful downtown you'll have. But of course, a huge part of that conversation is transit. Because, you know, you can have a walkable neighborhood without transit, but walkable cities rely on transit utterly, because you have to connect the walkable parts of the cities to each other, and you have to connect the jobs that aren't yet, you have to connect the houses that aren't yet downtown conveniently to the jobs that are downtown. And then finally, there's another question: what is underpriced and overrepresented? And the answer there is almost always parking. And Ray and I talked, and Ray, we decided I had an hour and a half to speak, so I put all this stuff in here. But parking, one of the things we said that we had to talk about was how you need to price your parking more intelligently here. And this fellow, Don Shoup, he's the master of American parking. He's figured it all out. Instead of asking the question, how can we have enough, he asked the question, how can we arrange parking so that our cities will thrive? Simple question. And the answer is basically to price it according to demand, as San Francisco is doing in a large part of the city, where you price it the right way so that there's always a limited vacancy so people who want to shop can shop. And cities that are doing that are raising the price of parking where there's a great demand, are succeeding above those who aren't. Finally, what's valuable in being wasted? And often that is also parking in the form of these parking decks that you find in downtown. This is Lowell, Massachusetts, where they had all these empty loft buildings to fill with residents, and they couldn't afford to do so because of the cost of providing parking for the potential new residents. And what they did was identify 5 city parking structures downtown that were empty all night. And they were assigned to the buildings, and they were able then to affordably fill the buildings with units. You have a lot of parking lots downtown. A lot of them are probably empty overnight. That can be used to float new development by lowering the cost, by making the parking effectively free. Second category is the safe walk. It's the biggest category. It's 100 different moving parts that I'm going to show you about 5 of them because we don't have much time. The first, of course, is the number of lanes, whether it be a highway or a city street. The more lanes, the less crossable the street is. And we've widened our streets to absorb new traffic, right? There's congestion because there's more cars than there is capacity. So we widen the street to absorb that. But what we learn is that there were all these latent trips that weren't happening, because in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. So it happens over and over again as you widen your streets. Newsweek magazine says today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. I wish most engineers knew that. Newsweek knows it. Most engineers don't. And they make you widen the road because they tell you the traffic's coming. Then the traffic comes and they say, see, we needed that extra lane. So the message here is, isn't that you might not need new roads or wider roads, but never do it in the name of congestion. This is the study that was presented at the Paris School of Economics. I have no idea what this means. But this means that every road fills up within 4 years. Every new road, every new lane fills up within 4 years. Metro areas that invested more in roads to ease congestion basically ended up lengthening everyone's commute and spending more money. So you've got some highways. You are much less attacked by highways in your downtown than many American cities. But certainly don't build any more, and start thinking about how you can selectively reduce your highway lanes. Here's an easy win. The 4-laner that you have in your downtown, the classic American road diet. When you turn a 4-laner into a 3-laner, like this, you gain an extra lane for bikes or for parking. Injuries drop precipitously, but surprisingly, the number of trips that the road handles doesn't change at all. So you can do that immediately on certain roads in your downtown. Additionally, the width of the lanes, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America, now allows us to witness the curvature of the earth, right? Because the standards have changed. 1960s subdivision, 1980s subdivision. Look what happened to the streets. My old neighborhood in Miami, they took away half our sidewalks and half our trees because the street wasn't draining properly, so the new standard kicked in. So wider streets or faster streets? Look at your lane widths here. Where can they be narrower? Right? Lane widths equal fatalities. So how long do we have to keep building wide streets? Many cities still have a 12-foot standard. I believe you now have the 10-foot standard, which this is stolen from a conference, bootlegged, but the next IT manual will say a 10-foot standard for all city streets. So make sure you don't get wider than that. One-way streets. One-way streets are not good for safety. They're not good for businesses. You have some one-way streets in your downtown. Vancouver, Washington famously converted this street back to two-way. Business doubled immediately. I'm working in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we're taking a half one-way, all 4-lane system, and we're making it an all, I say restripe, don't rebuild, restripe. It's much cheaper. We're making it an all, we're turning this into this, which allows you to turn this much parking into a lot more parking, and allows you to turn this much biking into a lot more biking. Reallocating street space, as an earlier speaker mentioned. Bikes, the greatest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. It's underway here. I was glad, this is Portland, Oregon, of course. My main message here is that bike activity follows investment. It's that simple. Climate, not so important. Topography, not so important. These kind of bike lanes that Gabe Klein showed you from Chicago, they mint cyclists, the protected, buffered bike lane. And I'm going to run ahead because there's a couple more things I want to say and I'm running out of time. But when this was put in New York City, of course there were more cyclists and fewer accidents and less speeding, but the road handled just as many cars as before. And that's a super important message. So biking is not a cult, okay? It is something that cities want. These are the maids who travel from house to house in Washington, D.C. on bicycles because we have the buffered bike lanes. And this is what tech companies are saying they want. So I congratulate you on your effort here. I'm going to stop there because I am out of time. But I've found that in work, and I haven't told you yet about the comfortable walk and about the interesting walk, so you'll just have to read the book or find me outside. However, what I've found, someone asked me earlier, what's the low-hanging fruit when you go to cities and they're looking to improve their walkability quickly, cheaply, effectively? And almost always it's looking at your streets, what's happening between your curbs, and reallocating street space, particularly where you have a disconnect between demand for lanes and supply of lanes. And we find it almost everywhere we go. So reallocating that space, I think, will be essential to you. Congratulations on the work you're doing already, and thank you for your attention.
We don't even need a question. You answered all questions. Are you good with that? Thanks. But Jeff, one thing, just the interesting walk. Do you have like the 50-word version of the interesting walk?
Well, the interesting walk basically, the interesting walk is not surprising. Basically, we want to see signs of other humans. We want to see not blank walls, and we don't want to look at parking decks. What's counterintuitive is the comfortable walk. And what the comfortable walk is, in 30 seconds or less, all animals simultaneously seek prospect and refuge. We can't help it. It's in our bones. And so we need to feel that our flanks are covered from attack. That means that when you're in a street space that has a surface parking lot or some other missing tooth, or it's not well shaped by buildings on either side, you actually flee that. You flee that street space. It becomes socio-fugal. So lining the streets with great buildings is almost as important as making them safe on the surface.
Great. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks.
Appreciate that. So thank you. That's a great talk. Next speaker is Peter Hirschberg, who is head of the Gray Area Art and Technology Center and a co-founder of Maker City, and is a person who is one of the most significant voices in America today about how technology can affect positive social impact. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Peter Hirschberg.
Thank you. There's this fascinating question about the role of art and technology in civic engagement today. We all kind of grew up thinking we knew the role of art. It was important, but it wasn't at the main table. What I want to talk about today is how that role is changing, almost mischievously so, and art has an enormous role in innovation, in urban design, clearly in industry and in technology development, and ultimately in economic development. Now, this comes from my own experience being a tech entrepreneur in the Bay Area, having launched a few internet companies, and then up in San Francisco realizing about 8 years ago that we had all of this amazing culture around software, emerging data visualization and software art, and we weren't really telling that story as ourselves as a city. So I co-founded something called Gray Area Foundation for the Art to try to bring all of that together. Right around the time that we started this, San Francisco opened up its data. We opened up the crime data, the transportation data. For example, here, Oakland, California opened its data, and citizens noticed that the crime of prostitution was being committed once a month from north to south on San Pablo Avenue. And looking at the data, they realized that wasn't how a crime was committed, that was lazy policing. And the act of opening that up, suddenly people were drawn into the environment. And a thing we found was when cities opened data, developers came in, software developers, artists, storytellers, and suddenly it was an attach point, an engagement point with the city. Technically, it's called an API, an application program interface. The data was opened up, and all these people that were busy doing something else realized the city was a platform that they could play with. That was a remarkable change. This is from an exhibit that we did a few years ago, and this shows crime in the part of town that we were in. Now, unfortunately, we were in the Tenderloin and it had the most crime, and I'm worried if we're showing an art exhibit that's based on city data and people come here and see crime, they're going to yell at me. They're like, don't bring this up, it's a bad idea. I was thinking open wasn't such a good idea. Boy, was I wrong. We put something like that up and the police came in and said, people are paying attention. I made that arrest. This was a part of town with the most single parents, and the moms were coming in and saying, people were paying attention here. So by opening up data, San Francisco created this invitation. For example, we had a very noisy part of town. What do you do about that? Artists went out and deployed sensors on their own volition on the walls and started gathering the data of where the noise was. And now suddenly we had something we could go talk to the city about, and we were collecting all of this. I got so excited about all of this app data artist thing. I went to City Hall one day, I was talking to one of our supervisors, and I was just going on about how all great this was, and he looked at me and go, what are you talking about? Will all of this art data app stuff get us elected? Will it help the city? And I realized I had enthusiastic data syndrome. that as much as we in the tech or art kind of cloistered world like this, we had to open this up. This had to be a conversation with everybody in the city, inclusively, to put new ideas on the table. Fortunately, we had an election coming up, and we decided to brand a series of innovation activities of hackathons and open government conversations, debates all summer long as the Summer of Smart, reminiscent of another Summer of that San Francisco had. We had 16 candidates. All of them got involved in hackathons around food, around nutrition, urban development, transportation. Bureaucrats got involved. It's a thing of beauty to see a bureaucrat and a software developer, because a bureaucrat thinks, I'll have an idea, and they won't do it for 5 years if that. And a software developer says, I'll have it on Monday morning. This sped things up. Suddenly, the candidates had to take all these great ideas. We called it ideas worth stealing. And this created this generative system where ideas that were coming from the art and technology community were flowing into the city. Here's one of them. Our head of public works says, wherever I see public art, or in this case, like street art, I don't see graffiti. And wherever I see graffiti, I don't see public art. Can we do something about this? If you're a software developer, you know this is a dating app. You're trying to build a date between artists and building owners. That's one of the things that came out of it. Here's a more recent example. This is a project, and that's that art example. This is a device that was built, kind of created as an art project. It has sensors of air pollution, humidity, temperature, light. It was created as a project that we were doing with the National Endowment for the Arts, but it picked up steam. This project, in an open source manner, is now part of a global data canvas network where artists and citizens working with cities deploy sensors, can share data, and understand the air quality in all of their cities. And most interestingly, a Chinese manufacturer found this and said, we'd love to get involved. So we now have a Chinese manufacturer setting up shop in an industrial part of town, and an art project becoming kind of a global conversation here. And this is kind of an example of what happens when you start deploying sensors in a city and people can share and work on all of that. This kind of effort has grown, and the most recent manifestation of it in San Francisco, oh, I should mention this. You know, we have this activist tradition in San Francisco. This is kind of from the Summer of Love. But there's a difference between the 1960s attitude towards dealing with the city and today. In the 1960s, if there was a problem, we protested the establishment. Today, we write to its API. This is what happens when the city's a platform and you feel like it's something you can get a hold of. Here's the most recent project. Market Street, which is our kind of main drag, is not that walking friendly, not that pedestrian friendly. It's slated to be torn up and redone in a couple of years, and there's a plan to make that better. But how would you activate it? How would you make it just completely delightful to be on the street? Well, based on the work we've done, the city planning department, funded by the Knight Foundation and working with an arts organization, realized we ought to open this up to the people. And so we had 50 projects come up from architects, designers, urbanists, spread out all over Market Street in the last week as a prototype for what the future might look like. Let me share that with you now.
Looking for a way, a process to actually bring that out into our public realm, and we thought our most important civic space, Market Street, would be a great place to start. How do you actually give that sense of individual agency to the community and to the residents of San Francisco?
It's not traditional public art. It's not commissioned, juried, incubated deeply, and it's not thought of in a permanent or even semi-permanent way. Prototyping is something different. It's process in public space, it's experimentation. And the prototypes that we've selected, I consider all of them to be artistic. You know, and what I'm after there is an expanded definition of what art is. A world where more people think of themselves as artists, and where artists are less marginalized and much more a part of the ongoing conversation and the ongoing fabric of their city.
So these projects went up for 4 days. They're being evaluated. Next summer, they'll come back having been studied. And the idea is to make things like this a permanent part of the city. And we're now looking at Market Street more like a Lego. The stuff won't be permanent. We'll always be updating it, always putting it in dialogue with people. And there's a number of things that we've learned from this. Probably one of the principal things that we learned is that, you know, prototypes are about failing and learning and seeing what works. And if you say failing and learning to an architect or someone who works in city government, it's terrifying. So this reduces the bar and opens that possibility up. We're kind of marrying up the sensibilities of web or technology development with cities and kind of reconciling them. It's less to-dos and more do-dos. It's a chance to kind of prototype and try things more. And importantly, it brings art out into new spaces. And we had 11 other Knight Foundation cities as part of us. This brings up the interesting role of the artist. You know, the artist has this interesting role of going across categories and discovering new things. And especially at a moment when we have so many new materials, code and things to discover, you find that this has a huge role in economic development. I was over at Autodesk recently talking with Mickey McManus, founder of Maya Design and now an Autodesk fellow.
Part of the idea here was, what if we engage with the extreme users and we just sort of wander, and we wander with them. We don't have a path. We just say the extreme users are probably doing things with our tools that we don't know about.
Not knowing anything about these technologies and then coming in and looking at what other people are doing and then saying, oh, I could use that, even though it's being used in architecture or in sculpture or to see all the different details that could actually be used in fashion that are not being used today. This is like kombucha culture, can be cut and sewn exactly like leather is, but it's grown just from tea and sugar.
She's a fashion designer coming to use all these new industrial techniques. Autodesk is learning from her. She's learning from them. Autodesk was one of the people working on that Market Street prototyping project. John Seeley Brown, my friend who used to run Xerox PARC, pointed out that it's the artist who can see across disciplines and help push things and find new things. And we're seeing it works in the city, it works in industry. It's a phenomenal role, and artists have always had this notion of pointing out what's new. Perspective kind of helped drive the Renaissance. When Impressionism was created, it's because oil paints moved outdoors. And interestingly, whenever this happens, artists do these things, but often they get in trouble for it. For example, Impressionism was released, but whenever a new movement of art comes out, people ask questions like, what is it? If you've seen the reviews of Impressionism lately, smear a panel with gray, plunk some black and yellow lines across it, and the enlightened few, the visionaries, explain, isn't that a perfect impression of the Bois de Meudon? And we see the same thing today when people talk about new technology-based art. This is from the first technology art show in 1968. And yet, technology artists can do amazing things for our cities.
This kind of gesture of climbing body, trying to, in a sense, climb up a surface. I was inspired by some footage of Africans trying to jump a fence to get into Europe. So there was like these tremendous climbing actions of a collective that's trying to, well, I guess, improve their life somehow.
So that's a project in Times Square that Daniel did. It's interesting to ask, what happens when you take this great energy to experiment in a city and these tools and techniques that are possible today, and what if you were to create a city just around that? A city that might be just a quarter of the size of Pittsburgh with the least government and the most freedom that you know, where you could make up your own rules and study that. Well, that actually exists. It's called Burning Man, the festival in California. 70,000 people build a temporary city every year, and it just has such a sense of agency. It doesn't exist unless you create it, and that form of art comes back to San Francisco and I think makes us a much more interesting and creative place. And so much of the innovation that's going on in the city right now is influenced by this. I'll give you one example. Oakland, California, like Pittsburgh, used to be largely industrial. It was 40% industrial. It's now down to just 4% industrial. Steel is 2% carbon. It's not a lot, but that makes all the difference in the world. Here's a space in Oakland that understands it needs to preserve some of that and create an economy around this.
This is Jingletown, Oakland. 6 months ago, this was not much more than a pigeon hotel and an abandoned storage facility. Today, it's become Moxie. It's an artist collective that is creating giant industrial sculpture. And not just that, It's an incubator for artists to think through what's the business model for all of this? How do they work together? How do you get distribution for things like this and share this kind of art with the world?
I live in California, but I'm a Pittsburgher. I mean, I've repped that everywhere I've lived, all over this continent, especially with like kind of computer technology and as it interfaces existing industrial technology. We have capacities as single people in small groups to do things that were unimaginable and only at an industrial scale before. I think that changes the whole notion of what a maker, an artist, a sculptor, or even someone who's just a dabbler can actually do. I think that Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Detroit come to mind as the three cities where makers, doers, and people who are interested in industry and or product development need to focus on. I mean, these are places where it's affordable, people want to work, they want to be engaged, and they could take some of the initiative that I've found out here in California and really catalyze some amazing stuff.
A lovely use of industrial space, and this kind of thinking has fed back amazingly in our city. I'll leave you with one more project created by two people from Burning Man using our city as the greatest canvas of all.
We're all moths, we all get this attraction to light. We move into this space of reflectiveness.
What could turn out to be one of the most flamboyant and expensive works of public art in Bay Area history appears to be close to reality.
When you stand next to the bridge, it's like being next to the Grand Canyon.
If the Bay Bridge was your canvas, what would you do on it?
You just move into a space of awe and terror, and we all suddenly sit there transfixed just by the magnitude of this piece.
Villarreal is the light sculpture artist with the grand idea.
No one's ever done this before. This is something very unique. You look down one side and it's 525 feet to the water. The other side is 250 feet to traffic.
Leo's interpretation of our discussions vastly exceeded anything I could have dreamed of. The impossibility is the thing that makes it possible. The impossibility is what inspires people to act around it.
With this entire project, there's certainly no guarantees. It's very complicated, it's very large scale.
People want to see it happen, and it shouldn't happen. These things they're not supposed to happen. The system is designed to say no.
You have to try. That's what I've learned, is that you just have to go for it.
So all of this is coming together now. The maker movement, the power of tools like this, the will to redo cities, this kind of new urbanism. The term that we're using to describe it is the maker city. It came up at the White House Makers Fair last year. We had 100 cities kind of sign on. I'm working on a book on this right now with Dale Doherty, who created the Maker Fair. And this seems to be one of the most exciting moments. And Pittsburgh, what better place? Here is a town that is got an enormous will to redevelop. It's steeped in all these manufacturing capabilities, has this wonderful art tradition, and as much of a software tradition as any place in the nation. If there's one place that can get it right, it's here. And it was such an honor to come and share this stuff with you, because all these ingredients are here, and this spark, this alloy of creativity, together with everything else, it will just be astounding. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Great. No, Peter, I'd ask you a question because I was going to ask you what's next, but I think you've already told us. There's so many nexts in what you've shown us, so much stuff that's looking ahead to what's coming for Pittsburgh or other places. It's really exciting. So there one other next, what's the other next thing? Since you covered about 3 of them. So is there a 4th one that we're going to learn about soon?
I think the big thing is that this tactical urbanism is now becoming strategic urbanism. City planners and architects are now realizing you can really use the crowd. The way that in social media, editors and brand managers had to learn this, architects used to think, please, not the crowd, but look at what this can do. I think that's what we should keep our eye on.
That's great. I appreciate
Thanks.
that. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Just one, we have a 10-minute break. With no summary today because we've got to move right on. We got a 10-minute break with an amazing performance by local place-based talent. And so please be back here, either stay for the performance or be back here within 10 minutes so that we can move on to the final panel with Bruce Katz leading it. Thank you so much.